So a very warm welcome to our game. Today we're looking at a game from 1987, a blockbuster clash between two former world champions, Mikhail Tal and Anatoly Karpov, who played with the Black Pieces. Two former world champions, Karpov just being dethroned in 1985 by Garry Kasparov, and Tal, this was just a few years before he died, so towards the end of his career, and this is a Blitz game, so you would have thought that maybe Karpov would have had the advantage, but is that how the game unfolded? Well, let's see. It began with e4, followed by c6, Caro-Can defense, c4, d5, and we have the Panov attack. Tal takes e takes d5, then we get c takes d5, and c takes d5 back. Then Karpov goes knight f6, we get knight c3. Doesn't protect the pawn, of course, because we've got two attackers onto this pawn, and Karpov takes the pawn, but instead of taking back, Tal decides to go knight f3. Then we get knight takes on c3, pawn takes on from b to c3, we get g6, followed by d4, g7, developing the dark square bishop, we get d3, we get castles by Karpov, castles by Tal, we get knight c6, rook to e1, attacking this pawn, so moving onto this half semi-open file, and as a result of that we get rook to e8 protecting the pawn, and then Tal plays this tricky move bishop to g5, which is pinning this pawn to the queen, because if you move you lose your queen. And so there's many different ways of dealing with this, but Karpov decides to play a somewhat maybe perplexing move of bishop to e6, with the idea maybe of, if you play knight to a5, you're stopping the pawn push in the center. But we're looking at a Mikhail Tal game. Can you imagine what he done? This probably took him about 2 seconds to do, because Tal, as we know, likes to sack all of his pieces, and brilliant move, rook takes bishop on e6, and then we get f takes e6. He offered up the exchange sack with the idea that now these light squares around the king are very weak, and as a result we then get bishop to c4, attacking the pawn and pinning it to the king. So we get queen to d6, we get queen to e2, loading up on this pawn. So you might think, well, how could you protect this pawn? There's many ways of doing it. Maybe what would you have thought? How could you have added another defender? What would you do here yourself? Well, you might think, well, what about going king to f7? That seems reasonable, but it falls to this beautiful tactic of bishop to f4. You think, oh, well, he's just after giving up a free bishop, but if you take, you get check and checkmate. So nice little sequence there. So another move that you could have done, and this is a really beautiful defensive maneuver, is king to h8, with the idea that you give up the pawn, but then you play this beautiful defensive move of knight to e5, blocking off the protection of the bishop. If you move the bishop back, well, then you just take on f3, and you see that the game is completely even. The computer gives us zeros. So if we go back after this beautiful move, if you take with the pawn and then the queen captures, we also see that here that in fact black is actually given the advantage. So a really beautiful defensive measure with moving the knight there. But in the game we had knight to d8 and protecting the pawn this way. After that we had bishop to e1, again loading up on this square. Then we get bishop to c8, obviously rather rook to c8. Bishop is protected by the queen, but it's x-raying this weak pawn behind it. And then we get, so not the best move, we get knight back to d2 with the idea it's protecting the bishop here, freeing up the queen, but also giving the opportunity to jump into the square and gain a tempo on the queen. After Karpov played king to h8, that's in fact what Tal played. He played knight to e4. Then we get queen to c7, which is attacking the bishop here. So bishop drops back, pawn's still protected by the knight. And we get e5. And here Tal comes up with a really beautiful attacking idea. He could take, but instead he decides to push the h pawn. So he goes h4. Then we get e takes d4, and because you've gone to h4, well, your clear idea for the game is that you want to open up around these light squares around the king. So he pushes h5, and here one of the best moves is queen to b6, because if you take, the queen just simply takes back and the game continues on. In fact, black has a slight advantage. But we see in the game that Karpov makes a poor error because he takes with the g pawn, and here black is already +5. Now there's a beautiful series of moves here. If you were Tal missed this in the game, but you have to be fair, it is a blitz game. But there's an unbelievable, brilliant move here. And you feel if it was a classical game that Tal would definitely have found it. And the brilliant move is knight to f6, because your rook is pinned, or the pawn is pinned because the rook is hanging. So if you decide to take, very simply, you're getting mated, so you can't do that. And if you decide to take with the bishop, well, then very simply, again, you're going to end up losing the queen because of this double bishop attack. You have to take. After queen takes and king goes to g7, you end up winning the queen, and you're very easily going to win this game as Tal. So what can you do? If you decided to go, well, what about going rook to f8 and attacking this way? Well, then you would take the pawn on h7, and you cannot take it with the king because it ends up being a mate in 1 after h6. Checkmate. So a beautiful sequence of moves if Tal had found it, but he didn't find it. Instead, in the game, he went to h5. Then we had rook to f6. We had c2 lining up a battery on this pawn. Then we had queen to e5. Now queen to e5 is a good move, you would think at first, because it's pinning the bishop to the queen, because the queen will be hanging. It's also pinning the rook to the knight, because if you move the knight away anywhere, the rook is just going to be hanging, and it's going to be hanging with check. So can you imagine what move did Tal play here? Well, you guessed it. He gave up the rook with a check. So he goes knight to g3. So why does this work? Well, very simply, after queen takes and king goes to h2, the engine actually says this game is completely level. But in the game, Karpov makes this dreadful error of going to h6. Instead, the move here, can you find a defensive move here? If you find this, I mean, you're doing brilliant, because this is an unbelievable move. Never would have thought you give up the sacrifice of the bishop, because after you play with the bishop back, you get this series of moves with rook to f7, then the bishop takes. You cannot take here because it's checkmate. So you get another pawn, and after, so yeah, you can't go there. So after f7, you take the pawn. Sorry, we're playing over the same thing. But basically, it very simply ends up being a level game that we see here. Because you play c6, then you drop the bishop back. If the rook takes, you take. King goes to g8, you play check. King goes to f8, you drop your queen back, and the game is completely level here. But instead in the game we got h6 played, which led to bishop taking on h6. You can't take back here because again you're letting yourself to be mated. So instead Karpov went to g8, and here Tal plays bishop takes on g7. Again, you cannot take it because there's a mate in 3. very simply, you come back here, you go here, you go here, and then no matter what happens, you end up getting mated in the corner. So after bishop takes, we get rooks takes on f2, and then after queen check on h7, I mean, Karpov is in all sorts of trouble here. It's a mate in 3. Can you see the sequence from here for a mate in 3? We get king to f7, queen to g6 check, king to g8, and after bishop to h6, the game was over as it was a mate in 1. So an incredibly exciting and attacking game by Tal on the former world champion and recent world champion. So I hope you enjoyed this game. If you did, please subscribe and leave a like or a comment.